child is one of the greatest gifts a family can receive, but sometimes a child can face various issues that can impact their ability to grow and function properly. This was the case for Makayla Norman, who was born with cerebral palsy, a condition that would leave her totally dependent on her mother and a series of specialized caregivers. But Makayla's life would be a short one, and one that would end painfully as the 14-year-old would die in her own home due to malnutrition and neglect, weighing only 28 pounds at the time of her passing. This is the story of Angela Norman and the case of the neglectful mother. Raising and caring for a disabled child is a challenge even under the best of circumstances, but it seems that Angela Norman was not up to the task, even with the help of numerous people. Her daughter Makayla was born with cerebral palsy and required around-the-clock care. Thankfully, Makayla had just that, as along with her mother, she had 3 separate nurses looking out for her well-being in one way or another. But even with all the help, by age 14, Makayla would be dead, weighing in at only 28 pounds, her body covered in lice, bed sores, and filth, all while the numerous people living and working in the home did very little to keep her alive and healthy. At the time of her death in the home lived Angela Norman, her mother, alongside her 18-year-old older sister. There was also Molly Parsons, a licensed practical nurse, who was paid to care for Makayla 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. On top of this was Catherine Williams, herself a registered nurse, who supervised Makayla's personal in-home nurse and visited the home on a monthly basis to check on Molly's work, as well as on Makayla's health. And lastly, there was Mary Kilby, herself also a registered nurse, serving as the main supervisor and manager of Makayla's case, who was also required to visit the home every 6 months. That's a total of 4 people who were dedicated to the health and well-being of young Makayla. In many of these cases that we talk about here, we see faults and lapses in the system for one reason or another. But in the case of Makayla Norman, the entire system, including the checks and balances there to prevent this, failed utterly. What makes this case even more egregious is the fact that Norman had already had run-ins with Children's Services, herself being investigated back in 2009, only 2 years before Makayla's eventual death. In that case, medical personnel had alerted Children's Services about issues regarding Makayla, but an investigation proved inconclusive, meaning that they had some idea and evidence of issues in the home, but not enough to move forward on. And all of these issues and failures would eventually come to a head on the evening of March 1st, 2011. On that evening, Makayla's nurse would clock out and make note that Makayla was in good health with all her vital signs stable and that she was resting comfortably. But minutes later, Makayla's mother was on the phone to emergency services, telling responders that her daughter was in distress. And within 30 minutes of that call, 14-year-old Makayla Norman would be dead. Her tiny 28-pound body covered in lice, sores, and caked on filth. An investigation would be quickly launched, where it came out that the home itself was filthy and Makayla was kept in unsafe conditions and not fed properly, both things compounding and leading to her eventual death. Detectives quickly found out that Makayla's personal nurse, who was supposed to be there 6 days a week for 8-hour shifts, was rarely ever there. Witnesses would tell investigators that Parsons was only seen about 4 times a month. And even on those occasions when she was seen, witnesses told investigators that Parsons often would simply honk her car horn to signal Makayla's mother to come out. The pair then leaving home on various shopping excursions. All the while, Makayla wasted away, slowly and painfully. Makayla was 100% dependent on all of her caregivers, and while each either passed the buck or outright ignored her, they all failed her. Makayla's body being half her recorded weight at the time of her death. Makayla could not walk, talk, or care for herself in any way, shape, or form. She was fed through a feeding tube and died slowly trapped inside her own body as those around her ignored her. Medical records taken after her death would show her horrendous condition. It noted that Makayla's hair, including her eyelashes, armpits, and more, were infested with lice at all stages of development. Her teeth were covered in thick layers of plaque, and her tongue covered in growths. Makayla's body was covered in bed sores from ears to her ankles, and her skin was caked with dried filth that altered her natural skin coloring. Her abdomen was also bulging prominently, her colon being severely impacted that it was nearly at the point of rupturing. Detectives on the scene also noted that Makayla had open and festering bed sores around her hips, where her diaper rested, that had all become caked and infected by feces. One detective who was on the scene stated that Makayla was a skeleton with skin draped over it, and that the scene that they walked into was horrific. For her part, Makayla's nurse Molly Parsons was sentenced to the maximum 10 years in prison after she pleaded guilty right before the trial was set to begin. The prosecutor on the case stated that Parsons most likely changed her plea to guilty to avoid any more details about Makayla's gruesome condition coming to light publicly at trial. The 2 other nurses that were responsible for Makayla were each sentenced to 5 years of probation, even though Kilby herself had visited the home only 5 days prior to Makayla's death, and it being impossible for her not to see the girl's condition if she had gone into the home and properly checked. Makayla's mother, Angela Norman, would be sentenced to 9 years in prison for her part after pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter and to 2 counts of endangering children.